Great. Thank you, Brigitte. Um, so first, I mean, I don't know how others felt about it, but it's so interesting to see how quickly the simple question, what does this mean to us, evokes so much. It always kind of causes me to ponder a little bit because, on the one hand, it's a very familiar word. You could even argue leadership is a very overused word. We talk about it, everybody talks about it. Um, and yet, on the other hand, it's fresh. And with just a little bit of thought, it brings forth a lot of reflections. So it's an interesting word in that sense. Words are just words, obviously, but it's very evocative because I think it's always orienting us towards things that really do matter. And so for years I've thought, oh, we'll just stop using this word, and oftentimes just don't use it because I do think it gets overused. But then we come back to it because it still has a certain power. And it's obviously not the word that has the power, but it's pointing to something that really does matter a lot to us. And I think the things you touched on, the people touched on very quickly, really illustrate that. How quickly, again, it connects us. It's a funny word also because it's not well understood, I really believe, just from a definitional standpoint. Very few people actually even know where the English verb to lead comes from. I actually think it was Otto Scharmer, who will be with you all next week in this same format. Otto's the one who pointed out to me that it's a very old word in English, comes from an Indo-European root. Leith, L-E-I-T-H, is the way it's typically written in our Western alphabet. And it basically means to step across the threshold, which I always think is a beautiful image because there's something, that word bravery, boldness, heart, that there's something about just the willingness to step ahead, which is a very powerful root image. Before we conceptualize and before we start talking a lot about words, just as a simple image, that willingness to step ahead is really what the word literally means, to step over a threshold. Otto pointed out to me that historically, in many settings, that threshold was also associated with dying. Not so much physical death, but what do I need to let go of? As I step ahead, what has to be jettisoned? What has to be left behind? It could be just the fear. It could be a concern about how I'll look. I'm stepping into a domain of incompetence, but we all have attachment to being competent. Am I willing to make a mistake? Am I willing to have something not work? Because we can't really do something truly new if we're obsessed with how it'll work and not making mistakes. So there's all these kind of fundamental images that get tied up with the simple image of stepping across this threshold. I also think that leadership is quite paradoxical. What I mean by paradoxical here is it's obviously very personal. At some level, it's very individual. It's I who step across the threshold. It's I who have to be willing to look at what might hold me back. What must I be prepared to let go of? But at another level, I think there's no real meaning to the notion of leadership except as a collective phenomenon. So we would never think in any domain, doesn't matter if it's the arts or science or community organizing or how organizations grow and develop or how networks of organizations start to work together in different ways. It's a collective phenomenon. We would never say, well, there's a great example of leadership if it was only one person. So it is deeply personal and it is inherently collective. hence what I was referring to as the kind of paradoxical nature of leadership. I also think it's quite masculine and quite feminine. And in fact, having had the opportunity to explore this territory with people around the world for a long time, I think there are really two broad domains of images and associations, one of which, in the archetypal sense, is inherently masculine: direction, action, doing something, the yang, the moving ahead, the blade in that iconic imagery, that movement. But it's also very feminine. A lot of the most important actions of leadership are simply to create a space, to create a place where people can come together and really have a different quality conversation. So leadership is also very much the womb, the chalice, the holding space. Otto often likes to use that image of a holding space, a platform, a place where people can gather. So it's a very rich image, both in terms of the masculine and the feminine. And I think, obviously, in this day and age, for virtually all of our cultures, I don't really see this being very different for any of the modern industrialized nations, East or West. We have this huge imbalance. Most of our dominant images are very masculine. They're all about making it happen, and leaders who drive change and all this kind of stuff. But in fact, in my experience, a lot of the most important things that people do is who comes together. What's the quality of listening? One of the terms that was also used in that early check-in. Is anybody really listening to anybody? Is there a space where we can hold the diversity of views and perspectives? So while the masculine imagery tends to be dominant, not a surprise, we all know that's kind of the characteristic of the age we've been living, more and more I think people are recognizing that it's actually the feminine that's equally important. I was just on a call this morning with a very close friend and organizer of a big initiative I'm part of now, a woman named Darcy Winslow. She led the work on sustainability at Nike for over 10 years, and Nike went from a company that really had no real focus on the social and environmental aspects of their business to really, I think, by many people's accounts, one of the world leaders, certainly in their industry, in the sports apparel industry, clearly a world leader on design for environmental sustainability, design for recycling. Nike started the organic cotton exchange about 10 years ago while Darcy was still there to bring more and more organic cotton to the global markets. They have a massive project today in China with all the major apparel manufacturers, Reebok, Adidas, Puma, all of them working together to eliminate toxins, a set of very basic toxins in the totality of the Chinese supply chain, which is a massive project. And Darcy was just telling me about returning from a 7-day retreat she has with a women's group that's been meeting for about 12 or 13 years. Started when she was still at Nike. And they just get together to just practice this holding a space. So I find this again, particularly in the sustainability area, a lot of the most important leaders, one, are women, and two, why are they so important as leaders? Because they're really connecting and accessing this feminine quality of leadership. So it's a very complex territory. As soon as we start thinking just a little about this very simple, almost mundane word of leadership, a vast complexity of subjects opens up. As far as basic competencies, the question that Brigitte posed, we've always kind of anchored on 3 basic competencies, and I think this goes back for a long time in our work. In the 5th discipline, when the revised edition of the 5th discipline was published, we included in that a little diagram, which had evolved over the years since the first edition was published, a little three-legged stool diagram pointing at these three basic competencies. And I think the word competency is not trivial, because what sits behind that is a very, very simple but important idea, that leadership is developable. I really think, from having been working in this territory for a long time, it's the first thing that we have to recognize. You know, this timeless question, are great leaders born or made? I once asked that question to a person in the U.S. Army, who I think is one of the most sophisticated organizations I've ever worked with in terms of developing leaders. And he told me a funny story, very famous story in the Army. The Army, U.S. Army, has had 3 5-star generals in their history, one of which was a man named George Marshall. Many of you may remember the Marshall Plan, because George Marshall became the Secretary of State for the United States after World War II ended, and Harry Truman was the president. Marshall became the Secretary of State, and is very famous for the Marshall Plan for how the United States would invest in the rebuilding of Europe. But even before that, he's very famous in the history of the U.S. Army for growing leaders. Many of the Army's most famous leaders were mentored by George Marshall, including people like Dwight Eisenhower, was a mentee of George Marshall. So anyhow, this young lieutenant in the Army asks General Marshall, are great leaders born or made? And as the story goes, Marshall responds, son, great leaders are born, then made. And I think that's such an important thing to remind ourselves of for each and every one of us, that it is a developmental journey. It is a lifelong journey. So when you talk about competencies, what's implicit in that word competency is, how do I grow and develop? What are some of the competencies that I can be focused on in my lifelong journey of growing and developing as a leader? And we've always seen 3. First is the ability to see the larger system in any setting, within an organization, among organizations, within a community, in any setting. There's always a larger system that I don't see. There's always aspects of the players, that you might say the stakeholders, that I'm not in touch with. There's always critical interdependencies that I'm blind to. How am I continually working to see the larger system? This also has to do with my own training. I was trained in systems thinking. That's the field at MIT that I came out of. So obviously I have a big stake in this for a long time. The principle of unintended consequences is a great one to use as part of the discipline of learning to see the larger system. We always are dealing with problems. That's inevitable. It's not good or bad, but we see something we don't like. We see something that's problematic. We want to do something about it, and we take an action. But very often, what we're focused on is the intended consequence of our action, where in fact a lot of what's really going on are the unintended consequences, the things that occur over here, or the things that occur a little bit later. We're focused on the next 3 months, and we've got our action and what we're trying to accomplish right here. But the really significant consequences are over there, and they're not now, they're later. So the principle of unintended consequences is a great lens, a very particular tool to use to continually keep inquiring into the larger system. You never see the whole system, ever, ever, ever. The web of interdependency within which we live our lives, within which we take actions, within which our organizations operate, is always bigger than we see. If we can only appreciate that and kind of hold that deep within us, it will always reinforce something else that was said, humility. No one sees the whole picture. And one of the great dangers of leadership, always, particularly in positions of power, one of the greatest dangers is arrogance. Thinking this is the answer. We just have to implement this plan and everything will be solved. But when you really appreciate that you never see the whole system, you cannot not be humble. You cannot not be curious. You cannot not stay open to what do I don't see. What is it that this person sees? I may not like this person. I certainly don't agree with them. They have a very different point of view. But they're seeing something in the larger system that I don't see. So it's also a foundation for building different qualities of relationships based on humility and genuine curiosity. The second core competency is reflection. One of my teachers for a very long time, a man named Humberto Maturana, I was looking at the map, and probably all of us look at that map of all the places people come from, and then we see the places there's nobody from. At least when I looked at the map a little while ago, there was no one from Chile. Humberto Maturana is a very famous biologist. He's now in his mid-80s, from Chile. And Humberto is quite famous in the field of biology for what's called the Santiago theory of cognition, how a biological organism like you and me actually produces something that you could call awareness. It's a profound question, I think one of the most important questions in science of the 20th century, and Humberto's pioneering understanding of the biology of cognition is really, I think, an Einstein-like contribution to science. Humberto is also, like Einstein, brilliant at really encapsulating and expressing some of his deepest ideas in very simple words. And Humberto often says, it is only through reflection, it is only through reflection that we change our history. We do what we do because that's what we do. It's true of us as individuals, it's true of us as institutions, it's true of our societies. Why do we do that? Because that's what we do. We are creatures of habit. That's not good or bad, it's just the characteristic of a living system. Until we see something that habitually we don't see. It is only through reflection that we change our history. It is only through holding up the mirror and seeing something about my own assumptions, my own ways of doing things that are so habitual, so automatic, that they're invisible to me until I reflect, until I see them. Now, very often, of course, the most powerful moments of reflection occur because somebody else sees something that I don't. And it's not just that they see something that I don't, that's like the opening. The real action is when I stop. And I actually take in that point of view. Because that action of taking it in is an action of reflection. And suddenly I realize, oh, there's something I'm blind to. We all have blind spots. That's not news. But building a capacity and working throughout our lives to continually be open to seeing our blind spots, which is clearly an openness of mind, but in fact it's also an openness of heart. Because seeing my blind spot is hard. It can be painful. It's always brings about humility, because we go, holy cow, how could I not see that? So it requires an openness of heart as well as an openness of mind to see our blind spots. That's reflection. And as Humberto says, it is only through reflection that we change our history. The third basic competence we've always called the creative process. How do we go from just reacting to problems? I said a few minutes ago, it's very natural that we focus on problems because our lives, individually, collectively, present circumstances that we go, that's not what I want. I want something different than this. We've got to do something about this. The problem is, our habitual way of dealing with those problems tends to be very reactive. And there's a very fundamental distinction that's always been central in our work, which is problem solving versus creating. In the problem-solving orientation, you're trying to make something you don't like go away. Perfectly understandable. But there's a subtle shift when we go from seeing something that we don't want, that we want to go away, to being able to answer the simple question, well, what do I really want? If this is what I don't want, what do I actually want? The shift from problem solving to creating is a simple shift from our energies going to make something less bad, less onerous, less negative, to actually our energies going to creating what we really want. Both are valid. Both are natural sources of attraction for our energy. It's not that problem solving is bad. The question is always, which is predominant? Is creating what we want the predominant orientation? If it is, then I guarantee you along the journey to bringing forth what you really want to see happen, you will deal with a lot of problems. So problem solving is not a problem. Having good skills in problem solving is pretty important. But for a lot of people, a lot of organizations, and most of our societies most of the time, that's all we've got, is reacting to problems. And the energy of reacting to problems is fundamentally different than the energy of creating what we really want. I once did a session many years ago with Peter Drucker on leadership, and in his inimitable style, this kind of icon of modern management, probably no single person in the world more famous as an expert on management in Asia, throughout the world, than Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker said, leadership is vision, nothing more. And while I think there is a little bit more, that statement is really the creative orientation. Because no word better encapsulates, when you really understand it deeply, no word better encapsulates the creative orientation than the word vision for cultures around the world for thousands of years. Because it's no more or less than the answer to the question, what do I want to create? What do I want to create? What do I want to see exist? Not just what problems are there. What do I want to see exist? The answer to that question is historically, traditionally, what you would call a vision. So those are the three core competencies we've always focused on: seeing the larger system, the ability to reflect, and the ability to help me and others shift from just reacting to problems to creating what we truly want to see. That's it.
What do you mean by that's it? We could have been we could have been sticking to this for, I don't know, some time more, I think. So what do you think, guys? Some hands, please. How do you feel? Thanks, Peter. Yes. Wow, that's it. Yeah, it's that easy. While you were talking, especially at the end, I was feeling like this problem-solving culture that we are suffering today, and I mean it's in every professional environment, probably after a special scale. I mean, and that would be a question maybe for you also. Right. How do we get out of this constraint that systems, when they become larger, they tend to focus more on the problem solving, and they create structures and rules of the game that are just focused on this problem solving, and not on creating. And let me just share one story from the last couple of months when I was talking to one of our controllers, and of course the role of the controller in an organization is really the one to control, so he should be controlling the creativity in the system. So he was telling me, and we are the product of a merger, so he said, you know, when I ask some of the guys on a specific part of their organization to do something in a specific time, and I put them, it's a deadline, it's not a happy line, he puts always deadline. So they just deliver in time. And the other guys from the other part of the organization, they always ask me, why? They're not just saying, I will, and I'm delivering on time. They always ask me, why? And so I told him, you know, there have been times in history there have been systems, and we Germans have to be really careful with that, where nobody was asking why. So I feel it's important to ask this question sometimes.
Right.
But when you start doing it, you get really in big trouble with the system. And so my question would be, how do we, and you know, you got to know a bit of the work we do as a group, and we have been
Right.
struggling to have this role of being the creative part. So when we are going into a meeting, we have this interesting role of being not a clown, but the person that has been in former times near to the king, telling him in a
Right.
funny way what was going wrong. And
Right.
so we have this role, and we're trying really to make use of it. But we can do this because we're just, I mean, like 8 people. What do you do in large systems? I mean, how do you really create a culture of creativity without chaos?
Right. Well, I mean, first off, I think it's important to respect both. I mean, if you're really a person trying to contribute in this way, so they're now speaking more as an individual. So if it's something I really see and I really care about, how do we create more capacity for innovation? How do we balance the creative and the controlling? Control is important, right? You know, this organism, this little system right here, doesn't have enough control. It's not viable. It is literally one of the definitions of a living system. It's called homeostasis, right? It's the ability to control all the things
Yeah.
that a living organism needs to control. So first off, when we're people who are trying to be effective advocates or change leaders in this direction, we always have to remind ourselves, are we coming from anger? Are we fighting against the controller? Or do we appreciate that they really are important? An organization needs good control processes. Now, the problem, of course, is it tends to drift and get very imbalanced. And then all that people are doing is avoiding making mistakes. All that they're doing is following the rules. And there gets to be so much energy around just doing what we're supposed to do and doing it right that we stop asking, are we actually doing the right thing? And that's why your question, why, is so important. It's interesting, you use the kind of the metaphor of, in English we would call it the jester, right? The jester was the person sitting to the side of the king or emperor who was, upsetting things, being humorous, being silly, but there was a purpose. You know, it's the role of the magician in the classic kind of 4 players that Carl Jung talked about, of the 4 archetypal roles in any complex system. The sovereign role, which has a lot to do with direction, the warrior role, which has to do with correcting if the direction is off, the lover, the follower, which is all about, again, the feminine holding of space, and then the magician, which is all about that, surprise, the question that nobody thought of, the jab in the ribs that causes everybody to go, wait a second, what's he or she talking about? It's a very important role, and the reason it's important is that it's part of continually rebalancing, so you don't just get overbalanced towards control, towards doing things the right way versus doing the right thing. And new people, young people in organizations are always inherently inclined to play this role. They say, well, why are we doing this? Why do we do it this way instead of this way? And everybody says, well, we do it this way because this is the way we do it, right? So, but of course nobody likes them because they're really a nuisance, just like the jester. In Native American traditions, it's called the trickster. Many southwestern cultures like Apache, it's coyote. Coyote is the symbol of the trickster. So interesting that you find metaphorically a recognition of this role that you were talking about in so many cultures, when people are really oriented towards the continual rebalancing. So I think the first thing is you have to appreciate the role of control. So if you're fighting, if you're angry, you won't be an effective trickster. You won't be an effective jester because your anger will come across, right? The emotion of anger will produce defensiveness. The acts of criticism will cause people to defend. Well, you don't understand. As opposed to being able to ask an artful question out of respect, but also out of recognizing that people really do need to rethink. In many ways, what I was saying before about reflection. Reflection is the solvent, is the antidote to getting out of our habitual ways of doing things. So it comes from a capacity to reflect, a capacity to ask really good questions, not manipulative questions, not trying to convince somebody that they're wrong, because if that's what you're doing, it's coming out of anger and judgment, but really out of curiosity. Gee, I really am curious what's going on here. And if the energy and the orientation is one of curiosity, not anger, then oftentimes you'll find people are really open. But that's a skill. There's a certain set of skills that you have to build in order to be an effective at fostering inquiry in a complicated situation. So respect and inquiry, the two core capacities in order to be an effective magician or jester.
Yeah, we are going to fix this too, respect and inquiry, because I think that's what we're doing, and it's really a revelation. Maybe the archetypal roles were quite clear, but to really get them on the table again and say, yeah, that's the role that we already have and that we should be getting better in. And yeah, it comes all back to you have to raise the good questions, well, the best ones, and that's I think that's the main art, and that's the thing that we have to get better with, because we are still, and I'm talking of myself also, we are still so good at giving answers and having the perfect recipe, for example, to be creative in the organization, and we don't do the rest. But well, the solution for example, for the part with the controller is then we're now doing a learning team. So we decided to create a tandem learning team. So he shows me to be what we call the bad cop, controlling, and I'm showing him how it feels like to be the magician and to be not the good cop, but the person that is always asking why or reflecting and doing it not in a funny but in a joyful way, maybe. Today, when just to share with everybody also now in the room, and I'm really frankly speaking on that, we decided really at the last moment to make this more public internally, because we just fell into account that this is something that we should be doing inside our organization to give the opportunity to do this together. And so I was sending it to about 4,000 people. And what happened was that the answers came from China, from Egypt, from Tanzania, from all over the planet when I was sending it just to my headquarters. So it was a bouncing effect. And then I really felt the system reacting and how the system was ticking. It was like taking the temperature of the system. So yeah, it was really important to see how we can use the system also, and to take it with us into this what we call great transformation. So I have been looking a bit also on what the chat said, and before we just go there, I would like to relate to the 3 basic competences that you have been explaining, that are widely explained in all the books that we have to really every day take into account, because everything is already studied and we just have to apply it. And you know, I think that what we did when we tried to also dig deeper on those competencies, we tried to work on an own competency system that basically is the same that you have been laying the foundations many years ago, and seeing the larger system is kind of introduced on what we call leveraging diversity. But maybe we have to be more explicit that the fifth discipline, the systemic view of the world, has to be learned by so many, because many of us are talking about systems being systemic, and they're not, and we are not. The second one, the reflection part, is really at the heart of what we try to do, and so we call it maybe transformation. And of course, the main skill you need to transform is to be able to reflect. And the third one, the problem solving, well, it's kind of translated into innovation, innovative action, or collective action, but with an innovative focus. And that's what brings us together also with the World Bank right now, to focus more on how do we really bring collective action to solve problems and to deal with challenges, and really talk about adaptive solutions and not just technical ones. And the fourth competence domain that we have been defining, exactly because collective action depends on it, is collaboration. And this MOOC is also such a good example for how do you do this. And our main learning is you can't control what will be happening here. You can't control the energy. You have, of course, an idea what you want to be bringing on, but as Maturana said, it's like it's an emerging. It's the principle of emergence. And just to tell you, while on the map maybe there wasn't stars, Chilean stars, but we have many people from Chile participating. And the first person that told me that, Brigitte, I think you are a leader. I said, what? I wasn't aware that maybe I had some energy that could move something. It was a teacher from Chile, and I never will forget the moment when she told me. I said, oh, that's interesting that you're telling me that you think that I am this kind of person. That was a learning from Chile from my side. So having a look on the
Yes. Oh, sorry. It seems that if I take the microphone, Brigitte gets muted automatically. Beautiful. Susanna has been collecting questions, but she then ran into a technical issue, meaning she had to leave and restart her computer. But one of the questions that's been coming up from the chat is this really this understanding of how reflection is important, but at the same time also how difficult it is to make space for reflection individually and collectively in our organizations when they're so focused on the quarterly results, and when there's an expectation that every 3 years you're going to be in a new role. Maybe very practical, like what guidance do you have for people here to be able to make more space for reflection in their lives and leadership practices?
Well, we've always found that a real discipline of reflection needs to get embedded within teams, within working teams. Obviously, it needs to be cultivated by us as individuals. So whatever practice individually, of journaling, quiet time, time in nature, I mean, we all need that. But in addition, it only will start to become real within an organization if it starts to become real within working teams. And what I mean by a team is basically whoever you need to get something done. You know, whether it's a formal team or you just stop and go, gee, in order to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish now, who are the people who need to really be collaborating, need to really be helping each other? And then amongst us, how do we embed time for reflection? So this could be as simple as whenever we have a team meeting, we start off with a little quiet time. You know, 5 minutes, no talking, just people journaling. A check-in is a very simple technique where you really hear a little bit from each person. You know, what's the question that's really important for me right now? Maybe you pause in the middle of a meeting, just go around the table and go, gee, what's the assumptions that each of you are hearing right now? So there's many different ways, But the important thing is you can't leave it to chance. You must make a commitment to create some time for reflection. I remember years ago talking to a guy who'd founded a very successful magazine. And he said the single most useful thing he found in his 15 years of managing the growth of that little organization, which became very successful, he said our weekly staff meeting used to be 1 hour, and everybody's reporting this and that. And, you know, it's always, you need more time than you have because there's so much going on. He said, we made it an hour and a half. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Why was that such a big deal? And he said, the last half hour, no agenda. We went around the table, and each person would share something they were thinking about or feeling, very important to acknowledge the feelings here, that they didn't say, and why they didn't say it. Well, I thought it would hurt that person's feelings. Or, I know you're the president, and I know you don't think this way. Whatever it is. He said that extra half hour was worth its weight in gold. And what they had basically done is collectively decided to create some space for reflection. If our teams are not meeting face-to-face, which of course is often the case, you have the exact same question though. When we're on a conference call, do we create a little time at the end of the call to reflect on what happened? When we're doing things on a platform or a webinar, is there a space for reflection? Literally a space on the platform. Whatever it is, the single idea here is it's too important to leave it to chance. If we're serious, we create the space. And you have to. And you need to do it collectively.
One of the things that we're exploring in this MOOC and is the notion of diversity in leadership, and we have participants from 100 countries around. So one question that is being brought up is, how do you deal with this difference? How can you evolve as a leader when you're in a completely different surrounding to where you are, to where you've grown up?
What you're used to. Well, this is a big challenge for all of us, obviously. You know, the first thing is just to recognize it is what it is, and for most of it, it's pretty challenging. I think this is where the whole curiosity thing is so important, that what we're often doing, in effect, is kind of navigating and trying to respond and adapt to what we see as different people's views, but sometimes just asking, can you say a little bit more about why you think that way? Now, that's the cultural inquiry, right? So it has to be done in a culturally appropriate way. In a lot of Western cultures, both I would say German and American as two examples, we're pretty direct. We still don't often ask that question. We're usually so busy advocating, but it's a little easier to be direct. Other cultures, Asian cultures, for example, sometimes you have to ask the question indirectly. But you can find a way. As long as you're sensitive and you ask somebody, is it okay if I ask you what led you to think about things that way? Or why do you think that's the right thing to do? Genuine questions are so important in appreciating cultural differences. The one other thing to appreciate is people really do process information in very different ways. I had a good friend who was the vice president of manufacturing for Intel, and one of the reasons he took that job many years ago is he was fascinated by the way Asians processed information. He said they're so much more, the Westerners typically, this is a generalization, I say, they want to get the answer. You know, he said, as American, we go, we sift through a bunch of stuff. Okay, what's the conclusion? He said, for many Asians, they don't work that way. They take in a lot of information, and they need time to process it. They need to have time to just sit with it. So if you say, hey, what's your idea? What do you think we should do in a typical American style? They won't respond. And then we say, oh, well, you know, they're quiet. They don't want to talk. He said, that's not true at all. He said, you need to give them time. And then when they're ready, you ask, you know, do you have a point of view now? Well, I need some more time. He said, then you relax, give them time. So appreciating that different cultures have different predispositions to literally how we think and process information will also give you a little more space. It's a huge challenge, but curiosity and sensitivity are the key.